What if the most celebrated hero in Western history wasn't driven by courage at all? What if the secret buried beneath one of the greatest legends ever told is something far more uncomfortable, a fear so deeply human that it still shapes the way millions of people live today? For nearly 3,000 years, Achilles has stood as a symbol of heroic greatness. His name survived the collapse of kingdoms, the rise and fall of empires, and the passing of entire civilizations. When people think of courage, they think of warriors like him. Men who seemed larger than life. Men who appeared willing to face anything. But there is a question hiding inside that reputation. A question most people never stop to ask. What kind of person willingly walks toward a future they know will destroy them? And more importantly, why? Because the strange thing about Achilles is that his story was never really about winning battles. It was about a choice. A choice that sits at the center of his entire identity. A long life, forgotten by history. Or a short life, remembered forever. At first glance, the answer seems obvious. He chose glory. He chose greatness. He chose immortality through legend. But that's where the mystery begins. Because choosing fame over safety does not automatically prove courage. Sometimes it can reveal something else. Sometimes the people who appear fearless are actually running from a fear so powerful that it controls every decision they make. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if Achilles wasn't running toward glory? What if he was running away from oblivion? Think about that for a moment. The image most people remember is the armor. The shining symbol of strength. The warrior who seemed untouchable. The hero standing at the center of an entire civilization's imagination. But armor has always carried a hidden message. People wear armor because something can hurt them. The stronger the armor, the more valuable the thing being protected. And in Achilles' case, perhaps the most important thing wasn't his body. Perhaps it was his name. This is where the story becomes much bigger than one man in ancient Greece. Because every civilization creates its own version of immortality. Some build monuments. Some build empires. Some write books. Some chase wealth, influence, status, followers, recognition. The methods change. The fear remains. The fear that one day the world will move on as if we were never here. Suddenly Achilles stops looking like a distant mythological figure. He starts looking uncomfortably familiar. The warrior standing before the walls of Troy becomes something else entirely. A mirror. And the contradiction at the heart of that mirror is impossible to ignore. The strongest warrior of his age may have been haunted by the same question that follows ordinary people today. If everything ends, what makes a life matter? That question transforms the meaning of heroism itself. Because if greatness is secretly fueled by fear, then the line between courage and cowardice becomes much harder to see. And that leads us to an even deeper mystery. Maybe the real battle of Achilles was never against an enemy standing across a battlefield. Maybe it was against the one opponent no human being has ever defeated. The possibility of being forgotten. If that was Achilles' true conflict, then something else becomes impossible to ignore. Why did the Greeks admire him so much in the first place? Because when we look closely at the world that created Achilles, we discover a civilization obsessed with a problem that still haunts us today. Not death. Memory. The ancient Greeks understood something that modern people often try to avoid. Every human life has an expiration date. Every achievement fades. Every generation eventually disappears. But they also believed there was one thing that could outlive the body. A name. And that changes the way we should look at Achilles. Because in his world, glory wasn't simply praise. It was survival in another form. The body could fail. The reputation could not. Suddenly, one of the most famous symbols associated with Achilles begins to take on a different meaning. His armor. Most people see it as a weapon of war. A symbol of power. But symbols become interesting when they reveal what they're trying to hide. The stronger the armor appears, the more vulnerable the person inside may feel. And this is where the contradiction deepens. Achilles was surrounded by proof of human fragility. Heroes died. Kings disappeared. Cities rose and fell. Even victory itself was temporary. Imagine standing in a world where every monument eventually crumbles and every great leader becomes a story told by strangers. What would you chase? Comfort? Or permanence? That question sits at the center of Achilles' psychology. Because the more he recognized the limits of human life, the more valuable remembrance became. And that creates a paradox that extends far beyond mythology. The people most driven to achieve extraordinary things are not always motivated by confidence. Sometimes they are motivated by awareness. An awareness of time. An awareness of mortality. An awareness that every hour moving forward is an hour that can never be reclaimed. What appears to be ambition on the surface may sometimes be anxiety in disguise. And if that's true, then Achilles begins to look less like a mythical warrior and more like a prototype. The first great example of a pattern humanity has repeated for thousands of years. Build something. Conquer something. Create something. Leave something behind. Not necessarily because you are fearless, but because you understand that you won't be here forever. This is where another figure enters the conversation. Not as an enemy. As a contrast. Hector. What makes Hector fascinating is not that he stands opposite Achilles. It is that he represents a completely different answer to the same question. Both men live under the shadow of mortality. Both understand loss. Both understand risk. But they embody different visions of meaning. One seeks lasting glory. The other becomes associated with duty, responsibility, and what exists in the present. And that contrast introduces a troubling possibility. What if the debate was never about who was stronger? What if it was about which response to mortality is healthier? To seek immortality through legacy? Or to find meaning within limits? The answer seems obvious until we examine our own lives. Because modern society often rewards the Achilles mindset. More success. More recognition. More visibility. More proof that we mattered. But every reward creates a hidden consequence. The harder someone chases symbolic immortality, the more they risk sacrificing the very life they hope to make meaningful. And now the mystery becomes even deeper. If Achilles spent his life trying to defeat oblivion through remembrance, then why does his story contain so many warnings about the cost of that pursuit? Why does the myth seem to celebrate glory on one level, while quietly questioning it on another? And what if the most important thing hidden inside the legend is not the reward of greatness, but the price that greatness demands? The deeper we go, the harder it becomes to separate greatness from fear. Because there is a contradiction sitting at the center of the Achilles myth that most people never notice. If glory was the answer, why does the story feel so restless? Why does the pursuit of everlasting remembrance never seem to produce lasting peace? That question matters because human beings tend to imagine desire as a straight line. We tell ourselves that if we achieve the thing we want most, satisfaction will naturally follow. More recognition. More success. More influence. More proof that our existence mattered. But Achilles forces us to confront a disturbing possibility. What if the pursuit itself is fueled by a problem that achievement can never solve? Think about the most famous image associated with him. Not the warrior. Not the battlefield. The heel. A tiny point of vulnerability attached to a figure remembered for extraordinary strength. That symbol survived for thousands of years because it reveals something universal. Every civilization celebrates power. Very few know what to do with weakness. And yet weakness is often the hidden architect of power. The fear of failure creates ambition. The fear of irrelevance creates achievement. The fear of loss creates control. The fear of death creates legacy. Suddenly the contradiction expands beyond one mythological figure. Achilles becomes part of a larger pattern. Not a hero. A blueprint. A blueprint that appears again and again throughout history. The great conqueror seeking a permanent place in history. The ruler building Monuments that outlive entire generations. The artist sacrificing comfort for immortality through creation. The entrepreneur working endlessly to leave a mark on the world. Different faces. Different centuries. The same underlying question. How do you escape disappearance? And this is where the crisis becomes much larger than Achilles himself. Because civilizations often reward the very behavior they privately warn against. They celebrate extraordinary achievement, then tell stories about its cost. They admire ambition, then write tragedies about where ambition leads. They honor greatness, then preserve warnings about the price greatness demands. The Greeks understood this tension better than most. That is why the Achilles myth feels strangely divided. On one level, it elevates glory. On another, it exposes the hunger beneath glory. And those are not the same thing. This distinction changes everything. Because courage and fear are usually presented as opposites. But what if they are partners? What if the most courageous people are not those who feel no fear, but those whose fears become powerful enough to drive extraordinary action? That possibility creates a new problem. If fear can create greatness, then greatness is no longer reliable evidence of wisdom. A person can build something magnificent for the wrong reason. A civilization can celebrate an achievement while misunderstanding the motive that produced it. And an entire culture can mistake obsession for virtue. Now the walls of Troy begin to look different. Not as military defenses. As a symbol. A memory fragment preserved across thousands of years. A wall separating two worlds. On one side stands human limitation. On the other stands the dream of permanence. Achilles appears to spend his existence standing at that boundary. Neither fully accepting mortality nor fully escaping it. And perhaps that is why his story refuses to disappear. Because it captures a tension that every generation inherits. The desire to matter. The knowledge that life is temporary. The refusal to accept the distance between those two truths. But here is where the mystery takes an unexpected turn. The greatest threat to Achilles may never have been mortality itself. It may have been something even more dangerous. The possibility that the pursuit of immortal glory was quietly transforming him into a servant of the very fear he was trying to defeat. And if that is true, then the question is no longer whether Achilles feared death. The real question is whether his search for meaning was leading him toward freedom or toward a different kind of captivity. Before we can answer whether Achilles was trapped by fear, we need to ask a different question. What exactly was he trying to become? The answer is more revealing than it first appears. Achilles was not merely pursuing victory, reputation, or even remembrance. At the deepest level, he represented something much older and more powerful, humanity's refusal to accept its own limits. That is the revelation hidden beneath the surface of the myth. Most people assume the central struggle is between a man and his mortality. But the deeper conflict is between a human being and the rules of existence itself. Achilles stands as a symbol of a desire that appears throughout history, across cultures and centuries. The desire not simply to live well, but to transcend the conditions of being human. This is why one of the most important memory fragments in the entire story is not a weapon, a city, or even a battlefield. It is a name. 3,000 years later, countless details have faded into obscurity, yet the name remains. That persistence reveals something extraordinary. Achilles succeeded in achieving what almost every human secretly desires. He escaped anonymity. But this is where the next layer of meaning begins to emerge. Because escaping anonymity is not the same as escaping mortality. The body disappears. The individual experience ends. What remains is a symbol. And symbols obey different rules than people. Once transformed into a symbol, a person no longer belongs to themselves. They belong to history. This creates a profound paradox. The more successful Achilles becomes as a symbol, the less visible he becomes as a human being. The legend grows larger while the person disappears inside it. Suddenly the story stops looking like a celebration and starts looking like a transaction. Humanity receives an immortal hero. The individual pays the price. This pattern extends far beyond mythology. Entire civilizations have repeated it. Leaders become monuments. Artists become icons. Innovators become legends. Yet the living person behind the symbol often vanishes beneath the weight of the image they created. The consequence is enormous. A culture that worships symbols can gradually lose interest in the humans who produce them. Achievement becomes sacred. Humanity becomes secondary. This is why Achilles occupies such an important place in the imagination of Western civilization. He is not merely a hero. He is one of the earliest models of a cultural belief that still shapes modern life. The belief that significance must be earned through extraordinary distinction. The belief that ordinary existence is somehow insufficient. The belief that being remembered is proof that a life mattered. But what if that assumption itself is flawed? What if the pursuit of symbolic immortality creates a hidden form of dependency? The more meaning becomes tied to recognition, the more vulnerable a person becomes to the possibility of being forgotten. In that sense, the search for immortality may actually strengthen the power of the very thing it seeks to overcome. The fear remains in control. The walls change. The armor changes. The centuries change. The fear does not. And this leads to a revelation that changes the entire framework of the discussion. Perhaps Achilles was never trapped by death. Perhaps he was trapped by an idea. An idea so persuasive that generations continued to inherit it long after the man himself was gone. Because if greatness is built on the need to be remembered, then the deepest mystery is no longer why Achilles pursued glory. The deepest mystery is why humanity continues to believe that remembrance and meaning are the same thing. If remembrance and meaning are not the same thing, then we arrive at the most important question in the entire story. What was Achilles actually chasing? Not glory. Not victory. Not even immortality. The deepest revelation hidden inside the myth is that Achilles represents a human temptation that is far older than any civilization. The temptation to solve an internal problem with an external achievement. This is the mistake that transforms the entire meaning of the story. Most interpretations assume that greatness is the destination. But greatness is not the destination. Greatness is the vehicle. The real destination is psychological certainty. The hope that one extraordinary accomplishment, one legendary achievement, one unforgettable legacy might finally silence the anxiety that follows every human life. The anxiety that asks a simple question. Did my existence matter? That is why Achilles remains relevant thousands of years later. Because the myth is not really about a hero. It is about a strategy. A strategy for confronting existential uncertainty. And once you see this, every major symbol in the story begins to align into a single pattern. The armor is no longer merely protection. It becomes a symbol of identity. The walls of Troy are no longer merely barriers. They become symbols of limitation. The famous vulnerable heel is no longer merely a weakness. It becomes a symbol of the truth every human being tries to escape. No matter how extraordinary the achievement, vulnerability remains. No matter how powerful the reputation, uncertainty remains. No matter how famous the name, mortality remains. This is the core revelation. Achilles never stood opposite death. He stood opposite acceptance. That distinction changes everything. Because the central conflict was never whether he could survive. It was whether he could accept the conditions of being human. And that conflict did not end in ancient Greece. It became one of the defining tensions of human civilization. Entire cultures built systems around the same dream. Build something larger than yourself. Leave a mark. Become unforgettable. Create permanence in a temporary world. There is nothing inherently wrong with these ambitions. Many of humanity's greatest achievements emerged from them. The problem appears when achievement becomes a substitute for meaning rather than an expression of meaning. That is the hidden consequence. When recognition becomes the source of identity, identity becomes dependent on recognition. When legacy becomes the source of value, value becomes dependent on legacy. And anything dependent on external validation can never provide lasting certainty. The hunger simply evolves. The target moves. The pursuit continues. This is why the myth feels so psychologically modern. The technology changed. The platforms changed. The institutions changed. Human nature did not. The same force that drove ancient heroes toward legendary status can drive modern individuals toward endless achievement, endless visibility, endless proof that they matter. Yet the deeper question remains unresolved. If meaning must constantly be earned, was it ever truly possessed? This brings us to the final memory fragment of the revelation. A name surviving for 3,000 years. At first glance, it appears to be the ultimate victory. But look closer. The name survived. The fear survived. The question survived. That may be the most important clue of all. Because the myth does not show us a man defeating uncertainty. It shows us a man becoming larger than life while still carrying the same fundamental human dilemma. And that creates a consequence far bigger than Achilles himself. If one of history's most enduring symbols of greatness could not fully escape this tension, then what does that suggest about the civilization that celebrated him? And what does it suggest about us, who continue to celebrate the same ideal in different forms thousands of years later? The most powerful myths do not survive because they answer questions. They survive because they continue asking them. And that is exactly why the legacy of Achilles reaches far beyond ancient Greece. His true influence was never limited to a single story, a single generation, or even a single civilization. His influence became an idea that quietly embedded itself into the cultural imagination of the West and, eventually, much of the modern world. The idea that a life becomes meaningful through distinction. The idea that significance must be earned. The idea that being remembered is somehow proof of being worthy. This is the consequence that stretches far beyond the individual. Because once a civilization adopts that belief, it begins reorganizing itself around it. Institutions reward visibility. Cultures celebrate achievement. History remembers exceptions rather than ordinary lives. And gradually, an invisible hierarchy emerges. Not between good and bad people, but between remembered people and forgotten people. This is where the legacy becomes psychologically complicated. The Achilles model inspires extraordinary accomplishments. It motivates exploration, innovation, art, leadership, discovery. Many of humanity's greatest achievements were created by people who wanted to leave something behind. Yet every powerful idea carries a shadow. The same belief that inspires greatness can also produce chronic dissatisfaction. Because if value depends on being remembered, then obscurity begins to feel like failure. And if obscurity feels like failure, then ordinary existence starts to lose its dignity. This may be the hidden cost that the myth quietly preserves. Not the cost paid by Achilles alone. The cost paid by every generation that inherits the same worldview. Consider one final memory fragment. A funeral fire. Not as a symbol of ending. As a symbol of transformation. The physical form disappears. The story remains. The individual vanishes. The symbol survives. That exchange lies at the heart of the legacy. And it forces us to confront a difficult question. What exactly are we preserving when we preserve a name? The person? Or our interpretation of the person? Because over time, legends become increasingly detached from the human beings who inspired them. Complexity fades. Ambiguity fades. Contradictions fade. What remains is an image. A cultural artifact. A symbol large enough for every generation to project its own values onto. This is why Achilles continues to evolve. Ancient audiences saw one thing. Modern audiences see another. Future audiences may see something entirely different. The legend survives because it is unfinished. It keeps adapting to new fears, new ambitions, and new questions. That realization creates a significant shift in perspective. Perhaps the ultimate legacy of Achilles is not heroic glory. Perhaps it is the conversation itself. The ongoing debate about what makes a life meaningful. The ongoing tension between achievement and acceptance. The ongoing struggle between ambition and contentment. And this is where the story expands beyond literature, beyond mythology, and beyond history. Every person eventually encounters the same crossroads. One path seeks validation through external recognition. The other seeks meaning independent of recognition. Most people spend their lives moving somewhere between the two. The tension never fully disappears. The dilemma never fully resolves. Which is exactly why Achilles still feels alive after 3,000 years. Not because he solved the problem, but because he embodied it. And that leaves us with a paradox that may be even more unsettling than anything we have explored so far. If the desire to be remembered can inspire greatness, create civilizations, and shape history, then is it a flaw that humanity should overcome? Or is it one of the essential forces that made civilization possible in the first place? Perhaps that is why this story refuses to stay in the past. Not because of what happened, but because of what it reveals. Across thousands of years, through changing languages, changing cultures, and changing definitions of success, one image remains strangely intact. A name carried through time. A suit of armor that could not solve the problem it was built to confront. A vulnerable heel attached to a figure remembered for strength. A fire that consumed a life while preserving a legend. These fragments endure because they point toward something larger than a single hero. They point toward a tension built into the human condition itself. Every person inherits limits. Limited time. Limited certainty. Limited control over how they will be remembered, or whether they will be remembered at all. Yet within those limits exists a persistent desire to reach beyond them. To matter. To leave a trace. To feel that our brief presence was connected to something enduring. This is where the deepest insight of the story begins to emerge. The value of the myth may not lie in its answer. It may lie in its refusal to provide one. Because the central question was never simply whether a person should seek greatness or accept limitation. Human beings seem destined to wrestle with both impulses at the same time. We want significance, yet we also want peace. We want achievement, yet we also want freedom. We want our lives to matter, yet we do not want our worth to depend entirely on what others remember. The tension remains unresolved because it is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be understood. And perhaps that is the hidden wisdom preserved beneath the legend. Not that glory is good. Not that glory is bad. But that every pursuit carries an invisible question inside it. What are we really searching for? A monument can survive for centuries and still fail to answer it. A famous name can echo through history and still fail to answer it. Even the most celebrated legacy can leave the question untouched. That realization transforms the meaning of the story. The most important inheritance left behind is not a model of heroism. It is a mirror. A mirror held up to every generation. A mirror asking whether ambition is serving life or replacing it. Whether achievement is expressing meaning or compensating for its absence. Whether the things we chase are helping us become more fully human or pulling us further away from ourselves. And this may be why the legend remains alive while countless others faded into silence. Not because it teaches certainty, but because it preserves uncertainty. It keeps open a conversation that no civilization has ever finished and no individual can completely escape. In the end, the most enduring mystery is not why one man wanted to be remembered. The mystery is why humanity continues to ask the same question in different forms, century after century. When everything temporary has passed away, when the armor has rusted, when the walls have fallen, when even the stories themselves begin to fade, what is it that truly gives a human life its meaning, and does that meaning depend on being remembered at all?